We have already noted, by way of our first session, that the wise men did not see the Christ child in Bethlehem. They saw him in Nazareth. In Bethlehem, Christ was born on the 1st of April. We proved that last Sunday night. And for those who do not think that the date of Christmas can be found, it is simply found in the Scripture, and it can be pinpointed with great accuracy. And we saw that last Sunday evening. Now we have continued in our series, and please remember, that's our type of Bible study here. It's important to organize and orient your lives around the Word of God facing a pastor-teacher. Otherwise, things are deleted and you have a missing piece of the puzzle to fit together. And it's extremely important. And this is just by way of my personal encouragement and love for you. You're going to miss out. And whenever you miss, it's a missing cog in the wheel. So we saw that Mary then was purified 8 days, purified 7 days. On the 8th day, Jesus Christ was circumcised. And then according to the Levitical law in Leviticus 12, 1 through 4, there are 33 days that she has to remain outside of the temple, making a total of 41 days. Then it says in Luke that they went from Bethlehem to Jerusalem to fulfill the law. After they accomplished that, they went back to their own city, Nazareth. We saw the time the star appeared was the day on which Jesus Christ was born. The shepherds were abiding in their flocks, and they said, "Unto you is born this day." And that is the day that the glory, the Shekinah glory, first appeared. That is the time when the wise men saw it, and then accordingly made preparation to come to Jerusalem to worship this king. All right. But we now have, and this is the best I could do by way of my printing, we now have 6 generations of Herod. We're only going to look at 4 generations, the one that started the fourfold family curse. Now, this is extremely important because all of these names pertain to the Christmas story, but especially the ones that I have underlined here and will make mention of later on. All of these names figure in the Christmas story, and several of them are involved in the fourfold generation curse. When did it start? Christmas. I hope that it's as clear as possible. And again, I'm not apologizing for my printing. It's the best I can do. And you make fun of my stick figures, we'll just have to make fun of my printing as well. Okay. The Herodian family started with a man by the name of Antipas. And Antipas was really not a very significant man in history, except he was born during the time and raised and lived during the time when Judas Maccabeus revolted against Antiochus Epiphanes, the Grecian, who came to the temple, offered sow's blood in the temple, and put his own statue there. Now, he is a type of Antichrist. The Jews, with Judas Maccabeus, revolted against him and recaptured the temple. Now, the Jews celebrate 8 days of what they call Hanukkah, and this man lived at the time whenever these Jews were celebrating that particular victory. Hanukkah simply is the Feast of Lights. Jesus Christ made reference to it and perhaps celebrated it as well. Had nothing to do with Christmas, just simply it coincides with the pagan time of year that we celebrate Christmas. So he relatively inconsequential man as far as history was concerned. But he understood and lived in the area in which the Hashmon family, now Maccabeus was of the house of Hashmon, and that's very important because after they recovered the temple, and they celebrated Hanukkah, the 8 days, where they only had enough oil for 1 day, and God performed a miracle and it burned 8 days. That's their Hanukkah and so forth. This man lived at that time. All right? Now, he then had a son by the name of Antipas II. Now, Antipas was, again, not very significant except for this. He founded a trade route through India to China that opened up trade to Rome. And because of that, he got to meet some of the people that were in the powers that be at that time, and he made a name for himself. And because of that, they appointed him what's known as procurator of Judea, or simply put, governor. Now, Pontius Pilate was a procurator or governor of Judea. Now, that's how the Herodian family more or less got entrenched in the politics of the area. So therefore, this man opening the trade route was a millionaire many times over. So Herod not only made millions for himself, that is Herod the Great, but he inherited millions. He was brought up, he had a good education. He was brought up in Rome. He was trained by Mark Antony. He was a good soldier, a good wrestler, top of the line, top of his class. In fact, because he became king later on, even later in life, he was barred from wrestling in the Olympian Games because he won all the time. They were tired of giving him the trophy. But when he became king, he couldn't wrestle anyway. So he was a tremendous man. But this, he got it from Antipater the second. Now, Antipater had 4 boys and a girl. You will note names you are familiar with here. Phasael, Joseph, Pheroras, Herod the Great, and Salome. Now, the 2 names you're familiar with is Herod the Great and Salome. Now, I'm going to explain this in just a little bit, and we're going to take our time. Probably have to do another part to this study, but we're going to take our time and go through this family. You know Herod the Great. He is the one that the wise men came to. And you know his sister, Salome. Now, in just a little bit, we're going to see another Salome who is related, and it's just an interesting story. Okay, pretty much Joseph and Pheroras were inconsequential to history, but Antipater's eldest son, Phasael, was well known, and he was a politician in Judea. Upon the death of his father, he took over, and the Parthians came down. Now, the Parthians, remember, as I told you in Sunday school, are important to the story because the Magi were Persians who later were called Parthians. They were warriors. Rome never conquered the Parthians. Now, they did drive them back, as well as Herod, but they hated Herod, they hated Rome, and they were never conquered by them. But at one time, Parthia conquered Jerusalem. Phasael was facing torture, and to show you how the thing is going to get started already, Antipater's eldest son, who didn't care very much for his people, the Jews, was imprisoned by the Parthians, and rather than face their torture, literally beat his brains against the prison wall and died in prison. He committed suicide by beating his brains out against the wall. Now, why is that important? Well, Antipas, the patriarch, was an Idumean. What's an Idumean? He's an Edomite. What's that? A son of Esau. What did Esau do? Despise his birthright. And he despised Jacob. There's the family. They were Arabs who wanted Israel to rule for themselves, you see. And when Arab has that kind of ambition and inordinate desire to take from the Jew, there is going to be a curse. But now, as you're going to see, we've got Herod the Great. He was a son of Antipater. He took over. When Antipater took over as the procurator from Rome, he appointed Herod the Great as what's known as a military prefect. That means he had charge of the armies of Judea under his father. Now, when his father died, then Herod took over, and then Phasael died, and Herod again took over instead of his brother. He became king of the Jews, and he was a tremendous fellow. So we're going to study him in just a little bit. And then his sister Salome. Salome is relatively inconsequential, except for the fact that she produced 2 children. Now, the first Salome here, and perhaps we should put Salome 1 over here, and we'll put Salome 2 here. That's not Salome, it's Salome. She was relatively inconsequential except for this. She produced 2 children, Antipater, who was inconsequential, but Bernice won. One of the most beautiful women in the ancient world. Now, mind you, all of these people were beautiful people. Herod the Great was gorgeous. He's described in history as being tall, having brown curly hair, a molded nose and ears, very beautiful eyelashes, very sensitive, slender lips, and he was a very muscular man. He was an athlete, a horseman, and so forth. And in the age of Augustus, the age of Roman glamour, he was one of the most beautiful people of all. Now, Herod the Great actually had 10 wives. I guess he had it, he flaunted it, I don't know. But the upshot here is that only 5 of them have anything to do with our story. First of all, he had a wife by the name of Doris, through which he acquired a son, Antipater. Now, Doris doesn't figure in very much in the story, except the son Antipater does in history, as we'll see in a moment. Secondly, he had a wife by the name of Mariamne the first. Now, if you think that Herod was beautiful, Mariamne is described as the dish of the day there, as far as the Roman culture was concerned. She was gorgeous. She was beautiful. Now, Herod married her for expediency's sake. Now, why? Well, because she came from the house of Hashmon. She was a purebred Jew. And she was the last of the house of Hashmon. Remember, ruling all the way back to Judas Maccabeus. She was popular and her family was well loved. But the Jews hated Herod because he was an Arab, an Idumean. So he becomes king of the Jews. What better way to bring 2 people together than simply to marry one of the house of Hashmon? Now, the second mistake he made here is that because she was so beautiful and sweet, he fell in love with her. It's the only woman he ever really loved. And again, doctrine, right man, right woman, the harem business is out. Basically, it's 1 for 1. And Mariamne was the only woman that he really loved. But as you'll see in a moment, because of Mariamne, he became a monster. Mariamne gave him 2 sons, Alexander and Aristobulus. When Alexander and Aristobulus were raised in Rome, they were always the favorite sons of the Roman court. The Senate loved them. They too were extremely handsome, charming, eloquent. They had everything going for them. Now, Alexander doesn't figure very much in history, except in one incident we'll tell you about in a moment. But Aristobulus is the guy we want to see. Why? Because Herod the Great's son, through Mariamne the first, Aristobulus, married the daughter of Salome I, Bernice I. And through this came all sorts of other Herods that figure in history. Now, Herod the Great is the one who tried to kill the baby Jesus. But Herod the Great, through Mariamne, is going to have a grandson by the name of Agrippa, a grandson by the name of Agrippa the First, who killed James, the brother of John the Apostle, just to please the Jews. He was going to kill the Apostle Peter as soon as the so-called Easter holidays, the Paschal feast days were over. And this man became a monster. But he came through Herod the Great, Mariamne, Aristobulus, and Bernice. And as you can see, already we have kin marrying kin. Boy, did they really intermarry. All right. Let's look at Mariamne 2. Mariamne 2 was a third wife we're going to see. She gave Herod the Great one son, Herod Philip. Now, why is Herod Philip important? Remember John the Baptist said to Herod Antipas the fox, "You're sinning because you have your brother Philip's wife, Herodias." Herodias was married to Philip. This gal down here was married to Philip. It was her uncle and cousin. Quite an arrangement, but that's what it was. Herodias married her uncle Herod Philip, who was the son of Herod the Great. Herod Philip was the tetrarch east of Galilee. Now, here's what happened. Because of some problems, Herod Philip was in Rome. And he met this gal, and Herodias is also called one of the most beautiful redheads of the ancient world. All of these gals were gorgeous. The only one that was less gorgeous than them all was perhaps Drusilla, and she is termed a knockout, but she was born at the same time as Bernice, and Bernice overshadowed her in beauty, and there was a rivalry there. But all of these gals are absolutely gorgeous. So they had three faults back then. It almost sounds like a modern day courtroom scene that we've just had. Money, power, and women. That was their downfall with all of the great kings here. But anyway, Herod Philip was at Rome, and he had already married Herodias. And Herod Antipas was called up there for a party, and he said, "Whoa, who is this gal here?" And said, "Well, that's your brother Philip's wife." And he connived and he coaxed her to simply divorce Philip and come and live with him. And thus John the Baptist got onto him and said, "You can't do that. You know, she was legally married to this guy, and you just can't simply go up there, waltz her off her feet, and have her divorce her husband and come back down here. That is illegal, especially according to Jewish law." Now, she married one uncle, and so she decided to marry the other uncle. Why? Because Herod Philip was not going to be much more than a tetrarch of Galilee. Herodias had ambitions of her own. She wanted to be a queen over all the land. And because of her ambitions to be queen over all, she said, "Herod Philip, he's a nothing, he's a nobody, but you, Antipas, the fox, you are somebody. I'm just going to marry you for my own ambition." All right, so Mariamne, only one son. Now, we have another lady. Now, remember that Mariamne here was a Jew. This lady that we're going to talk about here, it's not Malthace, but it's pronounced Malthake in the Greek. This gal was a Samaritan. So there is some Jewish blood being introduced, but it's mingled and half-breed. She produced two sons. One is Archelaus, and the other is Herod Antipas. Now, we had a question about Archelaus last Sunday evening, when it says that Herod died and his son Archelaus ruled in his stead. Archelaus got the throne all right, but he was so incompetent. I mean, he would do things just to provoke the anger to his people, Israel. And so therefore, he was simply deposed in about 6 BC, and his brother Herod Antipas then took over for him. But basically, Herod Antipas was another tetrarch. Archelaus ruled down in Jerusalem in the land of Judea. But they had a northern territory, and again, Herod Philip had the eastern part as a tetrarch, and Herod Antipas had the western part as a tetrarch. But Herod Philip was not going to be able to be moved up and promoted, but Herod Antipas was. All right? One more, a gal by the name of Cleopatra, and Cleopatra produced another son. And I see I've left one out here. We certainly don't want to do that. Cleopatra produced another son of Herod by the name of Philip. And guess who married Philip? Okay? Salome. She was the one who eventually married this guy. They all intermarried. All right. Now, with that, I'm going to explain the last two generations here in this chart. And probably that's all we're going to get through this morning, and you're just going to have to come back. It won't be tonight, but either Wednesday night or next Sunday morning, come back to fill in the details. Why? Well, you don't have to go see a Rambo movie if you want blood and guts and gore. You don't have to watch the daily soap operas if you want intrigue, suspicion, murder, and the rest of it. Because I'm telling you, this family, though they were beautiful, though they were rich, though they were successful, though they were tops in their political field and in almost every other, they were failures when it came to spiritual things, and God judged them. And the main sin He judged them for was their attitude, the attitude of their patriarch, Herod the Great, toward Christmas. Now, we better move on here. Through Aristobulus and Bernice, they had 5 children. Now, the first child they had was Herod of Chalcis. He doesn't figure very much in history. Herod Agrippa I does. As I said, he is one who tried to kill the apostles just to please the Jews. He died a horrible death. And by the way, it's an interesting thing. Herod the Great, in his 70th year, was judged of God with a curse. God took his health away. Now, again, I'm just going to say this at this point. Human suffering has a twofold prong. Either you are suffering for cursing or suffering for blessing. And when we pray, when somebody's out of fellowship with God, been a scoundrel all their lives, sin has caught up with them, and now they're in the hot seat and they're suffering, we dare not pray, Lord, turn it to blessing, unless that person is willing to take the suffering God sends them and to say, God, I humble myself. I realize that if you can hurt me this side of glory, you can hurt me the other side of glory. If I'm a believer, take away my rewards. If I'm an unbeliever, I'll suffer in hell. Suffering is done on this side of eternity to turn people back to God. And if they're unwilling, God pours on the suffering. And that's what happened to Herod the Great. It said in his 70th year that he suffered that whole year. He became frail and pale. It says that, and I am simply quoting history, I'm not trying to make a funny, though it is, but his breath was so atrocious that it simply, unless you were a health worker, you couldn't stand it. It was so bad. He had ulcerated stomach, a cancerous colon. Worms were eating him alive. And for that whole year, he screamed and writhed in pain. He owned all of the balsam groves. What is that? That's the ancient aspirin of the day. When somebody had a headache, they simply took a little balsam. And he owned all the balsam groves. He had a monopoly on it. Be like me, Johnson, over here, having all the monopoly on the medicine. He had all the balsam groves in the world. Boy, he was making a mint. But even his own balsam medicine could not stop the pain. He even tried going up near Jericho where he had some orchards and eating apples there, and he called for a paring knife and tried to take his own life and was stopped. Herod the Great died a miserable, painful death because he tried to kill Jesus Christ. He had a wrong attitude toward Christmas. And may I dare say that this world is suffering in hunger and pain and starvation and disease simply because when it comes to the baby Jesus, they feign with their mouths, I want to worship him. But God says they really want to destroy him. Now, secondly, Herod Antipas then. He was a fellow who lost everything, and I will tell you the story eventually. Herod Antipas lost everything. Here he was, this fantastic man called the Fox, and he and Herodias were called up to the Roman court, and they found out that he had a ploy with 70,000 stands of armor to fight against Rome with the Parthians. He made an agreement with the Parthians. And Caligula found out about it and said, "Is this true?" He said, "Yes." And right before him, he said, "You're stripped of everything. You're not allowed a job. You're not allowed to do anything. We're going to take you to the south of France." And there they starved to death, Herodias and Antipas. Agrippa I, as you recall the story, after he killed James and tried to kill Peter, he went to Caesarea, that Herod the Great had rebuilt, a fantastic city. And he made a speech to the Tyrians there. And they said, it's not a man, it's a God. It's not a man, it's a God. And he took their accolades. And what did the angel of the Lord do? Smote him. And he died 5 days later with the same disease that Herod the Great died with. The same one. Smote him. And he was eaten of worms, it says, like Herod the Great. Why? Because Herod the Great had a wrong attitude toward Christmas. And it started a 4-generation curse. That brings us then to Herod Agrippa I. Through his wife Cyprus, he had several children here. Now, as you see, Herod Antipas married Herodias, but Herodias had Salome through Herod Philip. Salome was not the fox's daughter, but stepdaughter. We'll see that in just a little bit too. Let me bring you to the last generation. Agrippa II. You know him. There are 2 chapters dedicated in the book of Acts to him. Porcius Festus didn't know what to do with the Apostle Paul. Felix became a no-good governor, and Felix had married Drusilla, and they died a horrible death. We'll talk about that later as well. But we want to get to Agrippa here, first of all. So Agrippa took over. Porcius Festus came down to Caesarea, and he was going to begin his governing for Rome. So Agrippa brings his sister, who is also his mistress, who later became his wife, down with him to Porcius Festus. Now, the same time, Bernice at one time married Herod of Chalcis, but she didn't like her uncle, so therefore she just simply said, I like my brother better. That's quite a story, isn't it? So Bernice, liking her brother better, went to live with Agrippa too. Now Agrippa brought Bernice down with Porcius Festus, and Festus said to Agrippa, "I've got a fellow named Paul, and I don't know what to do with him. I'm glad you've come down here. Maybe you can render just a little bit of help." Okay, so they brought Paul in. And the Apostle Paul was the one who said to Agrippa too, "You know these things, Agrippa." Why? Because Agrippa was brought up, as were all of these, with Jewish religious education. You see, because they lived in the land of the Jews, because they were Idumeans, and because they wanted some of the blessings of the Jews and have a respectable religion, all of them knew the Old Testament scriptures. Agrippa too, Paul says, was a scholar in the customs of his people. And he said, "This thing that I'm telling you about was not done in a corner." What thing? From the birth of Jesus Christ all the way to Agrippa II. What I'm telling you is that Messiah was born. Herod the Great, your great-great-grandfather, tried to kill him. It wasn't done in a corner. Everybody knew it. And then Herod Antipas was the one who scourged him and mocked him and put a purple robe on him and sent him back to Pilate to be crucified. It wasn't done in a corner. And then your father Agrippa I is the one who tried to kill all of the apostles of this same Christ, who is spoken of in the Old Testament. He said, "Agrippa, it wasn't done in a corner. You're familiar with the scriptures. You're familiar with the history." And Agrippa looked at the Apostle Paul and said, "Almost, man alive, almost you persuade me to be a Christian." And you know what? He went unpersuaded. Like the rest of his family, he was more interested in serving the world and having all of the dainties of the world than taking a stand for Jesus Christ. He would rather have a temporal Roman kingdom with temporal fame than to be in God's eternal kingdom with God glorifying him. So what happened? Well, Agrippa was taken to Rome later on. He was disgraced. He too died in poverty. Bernice, it's an interesting case. Show how fickle this gal was. Roman poets wrote of her, she was so gorgeous. And even though Drusilla was 10 years younger, Bernice was still the outstanding one. She was so beautiful. What happened to Bernice? Well, she married Herod of Chalcis, divorced her uncle for Agrippa. She liked her brother better. But when Agrippa was called back to Rome because he was in trouble, Bernice decides, well, I think that I'm going to just simply stick around here because there's going to come a Jewish war. So Vespasian came down. Vespasian was about 55. She became the mistress of Vespasian, the guy who started the war against Israel that ended up with his son Titus destroying the temple that Bernice's great-great-great-grandfather had built. She was now the mistress of the man who started the war, and Vespasian then, the other Caesar, Nero rather, got his throat cut in the midst of the time. There's about a 3-year period there where they were waging war. And what happened with Nero? Well, Vespasian was sent down to start this war because Nero didn't like this general. Nero was one, he fiddled while Rome. Well, he was one who learned to play the guitar and sing. He was horrendous, but because he controlled the army and he was emperor, anybody who came to see Nero sing applauded. This is the greatest guy. But Vespasian would always fall asleep during his performance or go like this and fall asleep. He was very, very rude to this man, and he did so purposely because here, what are you doing trying to play the guitar down in Nashville when you should be in Rome, ruling the best country in the world, Rome itself, the superpower. So he said, we got to do something to this guy. He said, you better not, because Vespasian is popular with the army and you're liable to have a civil war. He said, that's okay. We'll start a war with the Jews and we'll send Vespasian down there. Well, after Nero burned Rome and so forth, somebody decided he didn't sing very well, slit his throat, and the Roman Senate called Vespasian up to be the next emperor of Rome. So Titus was there, and Bernice said, well, Titus, since your daddy's gone, I'll be your mistress. Well, what happened then to Bernice? Bernice and Titus were to be married in Rome. The Roman Senate said no because of her background and history. She died of starvation in the gutters of Rome. Pauper. Now I'm going to tell you of two more here very quickly. Drusilla and Salome. Both of them had children. I've got just about 4 minutes, and we'll bring this to a close. We had quite a history lesson this morning, but it all pertains to Christmas. I'm telling you, Christmas is so heathen and pagan, it breaks my heart that folks are so misled and don't take the time to learn really what it's all about. It's about a curse. Jesus came in the fullness of time to die for man. He was made in flesh to do what? That he might condemn sin in the flesh. Who were the most fleshly people of his time? The Herodians. What did they do? They had a bad attitude toward him and his followers, and especially toward Christmas. What did Jesus Christ do to all of his followers? Kill them miserably. Disgrace them. Reduce them to nothing but paupers begging. All right. So Drusilla married Felix. Felix got called home, and he did have some money, but they wouldn't let him rule. So what did he decide to do? Buy the best farmland in Rome, or in Italy. It was on Mount Vesuvius. Oh, there were some rumblings there, but because of the lava, it was tremendous farm property. Anybody of any wealth bought property on Vesuvius because that showed you had money and status. So Felix sets Drusilla up and puts her on this rumbling volcano with his child. By the way, Salome and Philip had a son, and they were there too. What happened? In 79 AD, these two relatives of Herod the Great, were on Mount Vesuvius when it erupted. The eruption was so great that it blew 1,000 feet at the top of that mountain, completely to smithereens. History records they have evidently unearthed through archaeology the very place where these people were standing when the wall of lava came down and burnt them alive. Now, God's not playing with Christmas. I'm telling you, God's not playing with Christmas. You have a bad attitude toward Christmas. You teach those heathen doctrines. It's okay. You go ahead. They lived in luxury for a time. But there is always a payday someday. Vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord. Herod the Great died in pain. Herod Antipas died in starvation. Herod Agrippa I died in the same pain as his grandfather. Herod Agrippa II, he again was reduced to poverty. And all the rest of them were either killed in the explosion of the mountain or were reduced and died of starvation.